Hello, my name is Caleb. I'm 28 years old and I work as a software developer in a mid-sized tech firm in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a peaceful city, surrounded by lakes and pine trees, known more for its quiet winters and college football than anything else. But despite its serenity, for me, Madison has always echoed with loneliness. Not because of the city itself, but because of what I carried with me through every snowfall, every holiday, every milestone that should have felt special. I wasn't born into the family I grew up with. My earliest memories begin in the home of Martha and Greg, my adoptive parents. I was taken in as a baby, barely 2 months old, after being left in the care of child services under uncertain circumstances. That's what Martha would say during her cold explanations. "You were dropped off like a stray," she once muttered during an argument when I was a teenager. "We gave you a name, a bed. Be grateful." Martha and Greg had two biological kids of their own, Ben and Riley. Ben was a year younger than me, Riley 4 years younger. While they received hugs, praise, and affection, I got structure, rules, and silence. My room was the smallest in the house, tucked behind the laundry room. The walls were thin, and at night I would hear them laugh in the living room without me. I wasn't mistreated in the traditional sense. I wasn't beaten, I wasn't starved, but I was invisible, an afterthought, a placeholder. It was like being a shadow in a house of bright lights. When I was 9, during a school open house, I overheard Martha introducing Ben and Riley with pride. "These are my children," she said with a gleam in her eye. Then, with a nod in my direction, "That's Caleb. He's staying with us." Staying, not her son, not part of the family, just staying, like a long-term guest who'd overstayed his welcome. The feeling of not belonging only grew with time. I tried everything to be noticed. Straight A's, quiet obedience. I cleaned the dishes without being asked, shoveled snow from the driveway before Greg got home from work, even learned how to cook simple meals just to ease Martha's workload. She never thanked me. She'd just say, "You should help. It's the least you can do." One year, for Christmas, I saved up my allowance to buy her a necklace I saw in a local thrift store. I wrapped it myself with leftover newspaper and placed it under the tree, hidden behind the brightly colored boxes meant for Ben and Riley. On Christmas morning, she opened it with a blank expression. "Oh," she said, then tossed it onto the side table and moved on to Ben's Bluetooth speaker. I found the necklace in the trash 2 days later. But there was one person who always treated me differently. My grandfather, Allan. He wasn't related to me by blood, but that didn't seem to matter to him. He lived on a quiet farm about an hour north of Madison. Every summer, when school let out, I was sent to stay with him, mostly so Martha and Greg could have a break. But to me, those summers were the only time I felt truly seen. Allan called me champ, or kiddo, and told me stories about his days working in construction during the 70s. He taught me how to use a wrench, how to change a tire, and how to fish in the quiet pond near his property. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch with lemonade and watch the fireflies dance across the fields. One summer when I was 12, I asked him point blank, "Why don't they like me?" Allan sighed deeply, running his hand through his thinning hair. "Caleb," he said slowly, "some people don't know how to love what they didn't create. But that's not your fault. That's theirs. You're not broken. They're just blind." That sentence stayed with me for years. I often wondered about my real parents. The only thing Martha ever told me was that my mother was irresponsible and ran away. She made it sound like my very existence was a mistake. But Allan had a different take. One summer when I was 15, he pulled an old photo from a box in his attic and handed it to me. "She wasn't what they told you," he said. "She was young, scared, but she loved you. That I know." The photo was worn, slightly faded. A woman with long black hair and warm eyes, smiling beside a riverbank. She looked peaceful. Allan never explained how he got the photo, and I didn't ask. I tucked it away into a journal I kept hidden under my mattress at the farm. High school came and went. I graduated top of my class, got a scholarship to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and left that house behind as fast as I could. On the day I left, Martha handed me a duffel bag and said, "Good luck." Greg didn't even come downstairs. Ben and Riley were out with friends. There was no family dinner, no farewell, just me, my backpack, and the long walk to the bus stop. At college, I felt free. finally able to build a version of myself without their shadows over me. I majored in computer science, joined a few clubs, made friends who saw me as someone real, not just a burden. But even then, when the holidays came around, I felt the ache of what I never had. Thanksgiving was the hardest. I'd get photos from friends, laughing around tables with their families while I microwaved frozen meals in my dorm kitchen. I stopped going back home during breaks. I spent my holidays at Allan's farm or alone in my apartment. And each time he reminded me, "Caleb, you're not missing anything. You're building your life, one brick at a time." Now at 28, I have a steady job, a quiet apartment, and the independence I craved for so long. But something still gnaws at me, the emptiness where family should be. That void becomes most painful every November. Last Thanksgiving, I decided to do something different. I wanted to host a dinner, a proper one, and invite everyone. Martha, Greg, Ben, Riley, and Allan. Maybe I thought, just maybe if I made the effort, they would come. Maybe they'd finally see me, not as a guest or an obligation, but as someone worth sitting at the table with. I rented out a beautiful dining space at a rustic inn on the edge of Lake Mendota. I ordered all the traditional foods: roasted turkey, cranberry sauce, sweet potato casserole, pecan pie. I even handwrote invitations and mailed them weeks in advance. Allan was the only one who responded with a yes. The rest, silence. No RSVPs, no messages, just indifference. But I told myself, maybe they're planning a surprise. Maybe they'll show up last minute. I arrived early, set the table myself, arranged the name cards, adjusted the candles. By 6 p.m., the room was glowing with warmth and food aroma, but empty of guests. At 6:15, I called Martha. She answered on the third ring. "Caleb," she said, like I was a number she'd accidentally dialed. "Hey, are you guys on your way?" A pause. "Oh, we're doing something at home. Ben cooked. It didn't make sense to drive out. You'll be okay, right?" I said nothing. My hand gripped the phone tighter. "Happy Thanksgiving," she added, then hung up. I sat at the table alone, surrounded by enough food for 10 people, feeling the familiar sting I thought I'd outgrown. But at 6:42 p.m., the door opened, and Allan stepped in. He wore his old coat and a crooked smile. "Didn't think I'd let you eat all this alone, did you?" He sat down, poured us both a glass of cider, and picked up his fork. As we ate, he reached into his pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. "What's this?" I asked. He didn't answer, just nodded. Inside was a photo, the same one from the attic, and a note written in elegant handwriting. "Dear Caleb," it began, "I never stopped thinking of you." I stared at the note, my eyes tracing each letter like it might disappear if I blinked. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if the person writing had to pause between every few words. My chest tightened. "Is this from her?" I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. Allan nodded slowly, chewing his bite of turkey before swallowing. "She wrote that about a year ago. Sent it to me when she tracked me down. She didn't know where you were, but she was trying." I looked at the envelope again, feeling its weight shift in my hand like it carried more than paper, like it held the echo of a life that should have been mine. The note read, "Dear Caleb, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe this letter will get lost, maybe it'll be thrown away, but I have to try. You deserve to know you were never forgotten. I loved you the moment I knew I was pregnant. I was young, scared, and completely alone. My family turned their backs on me, and your father, he left as soon as he realized I wasn't going to terminate. I had nothing. I lived in shelters, skipped meals to save money, and cried most nights, wondering how I could give you a future. That's when I met Allan. He saw I was drowning, and when I told him I couldn't raise you without falling apart, he promised me he would protect you. I believed him. I still do. Not a day has passed that I haven't wondered what kind of boy you grew up to be. I hope you are kind. I hope you are strong. I hope you still smile, even when the world hasn't been kind to you. I've spent the last decade building a life from nothing, hoping one day I'd be worthy of being in yours. If you ever want to find me, I'll be waiting. With love, your mother, Evelyn." By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. The words blurred as tears welled up, and I had to set the paper down before I crushed it in my grip. I looked at Allan, whose eyes were shining too. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said gently. "I kept that letter until I felt like you were strong enough to handle the truth. I figured Thanksgiving, after what they pulled, might be the moment you needed it most. Do you think she really meant it? I asked. She's been trying to reach out for years. She sent a letter every Thanksgiving and your birthday. I didn't forward them. Maybe that was wrong, but I didn't want you to cling to hope if she wasn't ready. But now she is. I reached for the envelope again, turning it over. On the back was a Seattle return address. Seattle, a city I'd never been to, a name I'd only seen in movies or read in articles about tech startups and overpriced coffee. But in that moment, it felt like a signal fire, a new chapter flickering in the distance. Allan watched me silently, letting me process. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask why no one told me sooner. But more than that, I felt still. A strange calm washed over me. Not peace, not yet, but something close to clarity. I spent the rest of that night barely eating, picking at the food, my mind racing through timelines and questions. I thought of Martha and Greg back in their cozy house, Ben and Riley laughing around the table, probably without once wondering where I was or what I was feeling. They had abandoned me long ago, but someone out there hadn't. 2 days later, I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cursor blinked at the bottom of a blank email addressed to Evelyn's contact, e.thatcher@riverstonelegal.com. Allan had given me the full info she left with her most recent letter, her phone number, work address, and email. But I didn't know how to start. How do you reach out to a mother you've never met? Hi, I'm your son. Hello, remember me, the baby you left? None of it felt right. I closed the laptop. Instead, I picked up a pen and started writing a letter, real, paper and ink. I didn't try to make it poetic or profound, just honest. Dear Evelyn, my name is Caleb. I received your letter from Allan. I've spent most of my life not knowing who you were. Now I know. I don't know what I feel yet. There's a lot I need to unpack, but I'd like to talk. Maybe we can meet. Caleb. I placed it in an envelope, copied the address, and drove straight to the post office. I didn't hesitate at the counter, didn't second guess. I handed it off, walked out, and exhaled into the cold winter air like I'd been holding my breath for 28 years. Then I waited. A week passed, then another. Christmas decorations went up. Madison's streets turned icy and pale with snow. I kept telling myself I shouldn't hope too much, that maybe she got cold feet, that maybe she moved, that maybe I'd never hear from her. Then, on a Thursday night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Hello? There was silence on the other end for a second, then a quiet, trembling voice. Caleb, it said. My heart stopped. This is Evelyn, she whispered. I got your letter. I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened. All I could manage was a soft, hi. I was afraid you'd never write, she continued. I've waited so long just to hear your voice. She paused. I heard her sniffle. I don't know what you need from me, but I'm here now. However you want me in your life, or don't, I'll respect it. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I want to meet, I said. I don't know what comes next, but I want to know you. She exhaled like she'd been waiting her whole life to hear that. I'm in Seattle, she said. If you ever feel ready, I'll be waiting. I looked out the window at the snow drifting across my porch. I think I'm ready now, I said. A week later, I stood at gate C-17 of Dane County Regional Airport, clutching my worn-out carry-on and staring out at the snow-covered tarmac. The early morning sky was still dark, painted in deep indigos and charcoal grays. I hadn't told anyone at work where I was going, only that I needed time off for something personal. I didn't know anyone details, except maybe Allan. He was the only one who knew where I was headed. The morning I left, he met me in the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee already steaming on the table. He looked me over with tired eyes and a small, proud smile. You packed your guitar? He asked, taking a sip. Of course, I said. You might want to play it out there. Emotions don't know time zones. I smiled faintly, appreciating how Allan always knew the right thing to say without saying much at all. He pulled me into a hug at the door, one of the few times he ever had, and whispered, Whatever you find in Seattle, remember, your past doesn't define you. What you choose now does. Now waiting to board a flight to a city I'd never seen to meet a woman I'd never met, but who had shaped my entire life, I clung to those words like a raft in an ocean. The flight took off just before sunrise. And as we lifted into the sky, I stared out the window as Madison disappeared below me, its tiny snow-dusted houses shrinking into a toy town. I didn't feel nervous, not yet, just suspended in a strange kind of calm, like the moment right before a storm when the wind holds its breath. Seattle greeted me with gray clouds and a light drizzle. It was warmer than Madison, but the damp air seeped into my coat, making me shiver anyway. I stepped out of the airport, took a deep breath, and hailed a cab. Evelyn had offered to send someone to pick me up, but I said no. I needed to arrive on my own terms, to feel like I was walking toward this, not being carried. The driver was quiet, only glancing at me through the mirror once. We passed by rows of pine trees, glimmering buildings, and sidewalks crowded with umbrellas. I couldn't stop watching the rain. Back in Madison, rain meant thunder and mud, but here it was soft, steady, like it had nowhere else to be. When we pulled up to the building, I paused. Thornton and Park Legal Group. I stared at the polished glass doors for a few seconds before walking in. The lobby was sleek and minimal. White marble floors, gold accents, a soft instrumental piano track playing overhead. Everything smelled faintly of citrus and paper. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" I cleared my throat. "I'm here to see Evelyn Thatcher." She blinked, then typed something quickly into her computer. "She's expecting you. Take the elevator to the 9th floor, office 914. I thanked her and stepped into the elevator, my palms damp with sweat now. My calm had cracked somewhere between the cab and the front desk. The ride up felt endless, each floor lighting up like a countdown. 5, 6, 7. By the time I reached 9, my heart was pounding in my ears. I stepped out into a quiet hallway, soft carpet, framed artwork, the kind of place where everyone spoke in low voices and moved with purpose. I found the office, 914, and stood in front of it, frozen. What if I walked in and she looked nothing like me? What if she cried too hard or not at all? What if she said sorry and I didn't feel anything? What if this was just another disappointment wrapped in hope? Before I could spiral further, the door opened. There she was, Evelyn. She wore a navy blue blouse and dark jeans, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. She looked like the woman in the photo, but older, softer. Her eyes, the same gray-green shade as mine, widened the moment they met mine. "Caleb," she breathed, her voice catching in her throat. I didn't say anything. We stared at each other for a few seconds, or maybe an hour, until she stepped aside and whispered, "Come in." The office was small but warm. Bookshelves lined one wall, and the large window looked out onto the bay. A small plant sat on the edge of her desk, half drowned from the rain falling outside. We sat facing each other in silence, two people carrying 1,000 questions but too full of emotion to ask any. She smiled nervously, then said, "I didn't think this day would ever come." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice dry. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me, or if you'd be angry." "I don't know what I am," I said. "Not angry, not yet, just full." She nodded, biting her bottom lip. "That makes sense." I looked around, not sure where to start. "Why didn't you come for me?" I asked finally, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Evelyn inhaled deeply. "I wanted to," she said, "every single day, but I wasn't ready to give you anything. I had nothing, no money, no job, no home. I was broken, and I didn't want you to grow up watching me fall apart." "You could have tried." "I did," she said, tears forming. "I sent letters. Dozens. I showed up at your house once, when you were 5. I stood across the street and watched you play in the front yard. But I saw how they looked at you, your adoptive parents. Cold, distant. I thought, if I tried to interfere, it might make things worse. I thought if I just worked harder, became someone worth knowing, I could come back and give you something real. And now," I asked. "Now, I have something to offer. A home, time, myself. But if all you want is to ask questions and walk away, I'll respect that." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I leaned forward and asked, "Why the name Evelyn Thatcher? I thought your last name would be the same as mine." She smiled faintly. "I changed it when I moved out here. Thatcher was my mother's maiden name. I wanted a fresh start." "And you got one," I said. She nodded. "I built a life, but not a day passed that I didn't wish you were in it." The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain tapped gently on the glass like a metronome. I stood. "I don't know what I want from you yet," I said, "but I'm here." She rose too, tears finally spilling over. That's enough. That's everything. And then, without asking, I stepped forward and hugged her. Not tight, not long, just enough. Just enough to feel her heartbeat and to let her feel mine. The next morning, I woke up in a small hotel room in downtown Seattle. The rain had eased overnight, replaced by a thick fog that blanketed the streets below like a secret the city wasn't ready to share. I sat up in bed, staring out the window, watching headlights pass like quiet ghosts. I hadn't slept much. My body was still, but my mind was a storm. Meeting Evelyn had cracked something open in me, something I thought I'd sealed shut years ago. I wasn't angry at her, not exactly, but I wasn't at peace either. I had questions that weren't easy to shape into words, emotions that didn't know where to land. But beneath all that was something new, a flicker of curiosity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what I lacked. I was thinking about what might be waiting ahead. I showered, dressed, and headed downstairs, where Evelyn had promised to pick me up at 9 a.m. I waited just outside the hotel entrance, feeling the chill of Seattle's morning air crawl under my collar. At exactly 9:03, a silver SUV pulled up. The passenger window rolled down. "You like coffee?" Evelyn asked, smiling shyly. "I'm not really human without it," I replied. She laughed, a light, hesitant sound, and unlocked the door. We drove in silence at first, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the clicking of her turn signal. She looked different in the daylight, less composed, more human. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, like she was afraid I might vanish if she loosened up. "There's a place I go to every Saturday," she said after a while. "Small cafe by the pier. Quiet, no one stares." "That sounds good." The cafe was called Harbor Light. The sign was worn, the kind of place that didn't advertise itself. Inside, the scent of freshly ground beans mixed with the salty air blowing in from the bay. Wooden tables, framed photos of ships. A chalkboard menu with crooked lettering. It felt like a place where secrets could sit quietly and never be judged. We took a corner booth facing the water. Evelyn ordered a cappuccino. I got black coffee. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes. Then she said, "You don't have to pretend you're okay." I looked at her. "I'm not pretending," I said honestly. "I'm just processing." "I get that." She took a sip, then gently set the cup down. "I spent years imagining what this would feel like. Meeting you, talking to you. I thought I'd rehearse a speech, explain everything. But now that you're here," she looked out the window, "I don't want to waste this moment with prepared lines." "Then don't," I said. "Just talk." She nodded slowly. "I was 17 when I had you," she began. "My parents were strict, wealthy, obsessed with appearances. My boyfriend at the time, your biological father, was older, from the wrong side of the tracks, as they like to say. When I got pregnant, they told me I had two options: give you up or get out." I listened, every word settling heavy in my chest. "I left," she continued. "I thought love was enough, that we'd raise you together, find some cheap apartment, figure it out. But he left 2 weeks before you were born, said he wasn't ready, that I'd tricked him." Her jaw clenched as she spoke, not with anger, with shame. I was alone, broke, and terrified. I worked night shifts at a diner, slept in my car more nights than I want to admit. And then I met Allan. He came in one night, ordered coffee, and just noticed me. I don't know how, but he knew I was drowning. She paused. "When you were born, I held you for an hour, just one. I remember every second. Your tiny hands, the way you looked around like the world owed you an explanation." She smiled faintly. "You didn't cry, you just stared at me. I think I cried enough for both of us. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I finally exhaled." "I always imagined you just walked away," I said, voice low. "No," she whispered. "I handed you to Allan because I believed in him, because I wanted to come back better. But time passed, and the better I became, the harder it got to face what I'd missed. I thought I'd ruined any chance of being in your life." She looked at me, her eyes red now. "I thought maybe you'd be better off never knowing me." I didn't respond immediately. My hands were curled around the warm mug in front of me, my thoughts churning like the tide just beyond the cafe window. "You didn't ruin it," I finally said, "but you also didn't make it easy." "I know." I took a deep breath. "I grew up in a house where I was a ghost. They fed me, clothed me, but I was never wanted, not really. Every success I had was ignored. Every mistake felt like proof that I didn't belong. Evelyn reached across the table and gently touched my hand. Her fingers were cold. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she whispered. "If I could go back." "You can't," I cut in softly. "And I'm not here for an apology. I just want to understand who you are now, who I am, maybe even who we are, together." She nodded, blinking away tears. "I'd like that," she said. We sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after a door has been opened and two people are standing just inside, unsure how far to step. Later that day, Evelyn drove me through parts of Seattle that mattered to her. The neighborhood she lived in now, the law school she'd attended at night while juggling 3 jobs, the bookstore she escaped to when she needed to breathe. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to see her not just as the woman who left me, but the woman who had survived to find her way back. By evening, she dropped me off at my hotel again. Before I got out of the car, I turned to her. "Would you want to meet Allan sometime? Maybe we could all have dinner?" Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. "I'd love that." I nodded. Then just before closing the door, I added, "And maybe tell me more about my dad one day, when you're ready." She hesitated, then gave a solemn nod. "I will, when the time's right." And with that, I stepped out into the Seattle night, the fog now lighter, the air easier to breathe. For the first time in my life, the word family didn't sting. It didn't echo with rejection or silence. It felt like a whisper finally turning into a voice. I flew back to Madison 3 days later, and nothing looked the same. The streets were still frozen, my apartment still cold in the mornings, the same mail piled up on the counter. But I was different now. Something had shifted, like I had crossed an invisible line and couldn't walk back. And even if I could, I didn't want to. Evelyn and I exchanged texts every evening now. Short ones, mostly. She'd send a picture of the sunset over Puget Sound. I'd reply with a blurry photo of my half-eaten dinner or some code I was working on at 2 a.m. We didn't need to say much. Just the act of checking in. It mattered. It filled a space I'd carried empty for far too long. A week after I got back, Allan called. "How was it?" he asked. No preamble, just that signature quiet warmth in his voice. "It was honest," I said. "That's good." I hesitated, then added, "I want you to come with me next time. She wants to see you, to thank you." There was a long pause on the line. Then he said, "I'd like that, Caleb. It's time." 3 weeks later, we boarded a flight together. Allan's first time on a plane in over 30 years. He grumbled the whole way through security, but I caught him staring out the window like a curious kid the entire flight. "She's nervous," I told him while we waited at baggage claim. Evelyn, she's been replaying this moment for years," Allan just nodded. "I have too." When we walked out of the terminal, Evelyn was there, leaning against her car, arms folded tightly like she was trying to hold herself together. Her eyes widened when she saw us, and without hesitation, she walked straight up to Allan and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she whispered. Allan, always the steady one, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You found your way home. That's what counts." That night, we had dinner at Evelyn's apartment. A quiet place with warm lighting, shelves full of books, and a small fireplace that crackled behind us like background music. Allan told stories from the farm, about the time I'd fallen into a patch of mud trying to chase a chicken, or when we'd stayed up all night stargazing and missed my science fair the next day. Evelyn laughed in a way I hadn't heard before. She let go, just a little, and I saw pieces of myself in her. The way she stirred her tea absent-mindedly, the way she tilted her head when she listened. Mannerisms that no one had taught me, but I'd carried anyway. After dinner, Allan and I stepped out onto the balcony while Evelyn cleaned up inside. "You know," he said, staring out at the city skyline, "you're not the same kid I raised." "How so?" "You've got fire now," he said. "Still gentle, still kind, but not apologizing for existing anymore." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because I felt it too. Later that night, Evelyn handed me a photo album I'd never seen before. It was old, the cover fraying at the edges. Inside were pictures I couldn't believe existed. A grainy image of her holding me at the hospital, her face pale but beaming. Another of Allan rocking me on the porch of the farmhouse. A third, one I had never seen but felt like I remembered, of me asleep in a laundry basket, Evelyn sitting beside me on the floor, her hand on my chest, eyes red with exhaustion. I kept these, she said softly. Even after I left, even when I had nothing, these were all I had of you. I flipped through them slowly, the weight of every image settling into me like soft bricks, building something I'd never had before, a sense of origin, a quiet affirmation. You came from somewhere. You were loved, even when it didn't reach you. Thank you, I said, closing the album, for not giving up. She smiled. Thank you for letting me try. We didn't say goodnight with a hug that evening. We just exchanged a quiet look that meant more than any gesture could. A mutual understanding. Healing wasn't instant. It would take time. But we were doing it together. Back in Madison, I kept working, kept living, but Seattle pulled at me like gravity. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner alone in my apartment, I found myself rereading Evelyn's old letters, the ones Allan had saved. In one, dated 3 years prior, she wrote, I hope you're safe. I hope you're not as lonely as I fear. If I could give you one thing, Caleb, it would be a place where you feel you truly belong. That was it. That word, belong. It echoed in me like a forgotten melody. The next day I called Evelyn. I think I'm ready to move, I said. She didn't say anything right away. When she finally replied, her voice was steady. Then let's build you a home. I arrived in Seattle with 2 suitcases, a guitar, and a mind buzzing with both fear and excitement. It wasn't the kind of move people make for a job or a relationship. It wasn't even about starting over. It was about claiming a life that had waited too long for me to step into it. Evelyn helped me find a modest apartment a few blocks from her place. It was small, a studio with a slanted ceiling and chipped tile in the bathroom, but the moment I stepped in, it felt like mine. Like a space that could absorb my past without being haunted by it. Allan flew in the following weekend to help me unpack. He brought his favorite toolkit, even though there wasn't much to fix. You need something to hang this on, he muttered, holding up a photo of us from the farm, me grinning with dirt on my face, holding a crooked tomato. Evelyn joined us later with groceries and a potted plant. A housewarming gift, she said, setting it by the window. It's a jade plant, supposed to bring good luck. Then I guess I better not kill it, I replied with a small smile. We spent that first evening in my half-furnished apartment eating takeout on the floor, surrounded by boxes and laughter. There was no grand moment of realization, no dramatic reconciliation, just the quiet comfort of presence, of people choosing to show up for each other. Within 2 weeks, I landed a job as a junior financial analyst at a local firm. Not because of Evelyn, though she offered. I declined. I needed this on my own terms. The team was welcoming, the work was familiar, but the biggest shift was this. I didn't dread going home at night. Evelyn would check in most evenings. Sometimes we'd meet for dinner. Other times she'd drop off leftover stew or ask if I wanted to go for a walk. I was still figuring out how to let her in, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. One night, I told her about the attic room back in Madison, how small it felt, how the walls seemed to close in on me some nights, like they were made of everything I couldn't say out loud. I used to imagine, I confessed, that someone out there was thinking of me, even if I didn't know who. I was, she whispered, eyes glossy, every single day. We sat in silence after that, the city breathing quietly around us. A few months passed. Allan settled into a cozy cottage on the edge of town, not far from a lake. Evelyn visited often. So did I. We made a ritual out of Saturday evenings. Dinner at his place, Allan's old guitar making its way out by dessert. Sometimes he played, sometimes I did. Once, Evelyn joined in with a song I didn't recognize, something soft, almost sad about holding on through storms. Those nights became our anchor, a way to tether ourselves to something honest, real, ours. But healing isn't a straight path. One spring morning, a letter arrived at my new apartment. The handwriting was familiar. It was from Martha. The envelope was thick. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note, neatly folded. I read it slowly. Caleb, I suppose I owe you an apology. I'm not very good at those, so I'll just say this. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed, and I don't know if that's something you can forgive, but I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. For the silence, for the distance, for making you feel like you were less than. Ben's in trouble again. Riley moved out and rarely calls. The house feels too big and too empty. I think about you a lot these days. I saw your name on LinkedIn. You look happy. I hope you are. I never stopped thinking of you. I just didn't know how to reach you once I realized how much I'd lost. If you ever want to talk, my number hasn't changed, Martha. I sat with the letter for a long time. Allan read it too. He didn't say much, just folded it back up and said, "You don't owe her anything, but forgiveness, that's for you, not her." I didn't call Martha, not right away, not because I hated her, but because I needed to sit with what her words stirred in me, pain. Yes, but also clarity. She had the chance to love me, and she chose not to. I didn't need her apology to move forward, but maybe she needed to give it, and maybe in time that would be enough. That summer, Evelyn invited me on a weekend trip to Orcas Island, a quiet place off the coast where the air smelled like pine and salt. We stayed in a tiny cabin with no cell service, just the three of us, me, her, and Allan. One night, we sat around a fire pit, the stars stretching wide above us. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and said, "Do you ever think about the little things you missed? The normal stuff, school plays, birthdays, scraped knees?" I nodded. All the time. But I also think about what I gained. Perspective. Strength. You, Allan. She smiled at that. Allan poked at the fire, then said, "Family isn't who claims you. It's who shows up. That's what matters in the end." We stayed up for hours that night, telling stories, roasting marshmallows, laughing about things that once made us cry. And somewhere between the flickering flames and the rhythm of waves against the shore, I realized something. I wasn't trying to escape my past anymore. I was building something new, something lasting, something mine. By the end of summer, Seattle no longer felt like a new place. It felt like home. I knew the rhythm of the city now, the way the fog rolled in like a tide every morning, the barista who always added one too many shots of espresso, the tiny bookstore near my apartment where the clerk recommended sad poetry without judgment. It all became familiar, the kind of familiar I'd craved my entire life. My days found a gentle structure. Work at the firm kept me busy. Evenings were often spent at Allan's cottage or in Evelyn's apartment, where we sometimes cooked in silence, content just to exist in the same room. Other nights, I stayed in, strumming my guitar by the window while the rain traced lines down the glass. It was quiet, and I liked it that way. But quiet didn't mean stagnant. One afternoon in early September, Evelyn invited me to join her at an event hosted by her firm, a charity benefit for displaced youth. "It's not fancy," she said, "just people who care, trying to do something real." I almost declined. I didn't like crowds, I didn't like dressing up, and I certainly didn't like talking about my past in public. But something in her voice made me say yes. I wore a black suit, one Evelyn helped me pick out. She said it brought out the green in my eyes. I didn't argue. The event was held in a hall overlooking the bay, glass walls letting in the gold of the setting sun. There were too many people, too much chatter, and way too many canapes. But Evelyn made it easier. She introduced me to everyone as her son, not my son who I just reconnected with, not Caleb who has a complicated story, just her son. I didn't realize how much I'd wanted to hear those words until that moment. Later in the evening, someone tapped my shoulder. A woman in her 50s, tall, graceful, with streaks of gray in her dark hair. She held a glass of wine and wore an expensive smile. "You're Evelyn's boy," she said warmly. "Caleb, right?" I nodded, offering a polite smile. "Yes, that's me." I just wanted to say I don't know your story and I won't pretend to, but the way she talks about you, like she's been waiting her whole life to find you again. My chest tightened. "Thank you," I said softly. She touched my arm gently, then disappeared into the crowd. I found Evelyn standing near the buffet table a few minutes later, nervously adjusting a tray of hors d'oeuvres even though she didn't work there. "You okay?" I asked. She turned, startled. "Oh yeah, I still get anxious at these things." "Someone just told me you talk about me a lot," I said, watching her reaction. Her cheeks flushed. "Is that embarrassing?" "No," I said. "It means something." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You mean something." And in that moment, surrounded by polished shoes, fake laughter, and overpriced art on the walls, I felt more grounded than I ever had. A few weeks later, Allan had a health scare. It was a Wednesday evening when I got the call. He'd collapsed while gardening, and a neighbor had rushed him to the hospital. I dropped everything and ran to the emergency room, heart in my throat the entire ride. By the time I arrived, Evelyn was already there, sitting beside his bed. He was awake, pale, hooked up to wires but conscious. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a weak smile. "Guess I overdid it with the tomatoes." "You scared me," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "Scared myself a bit too," he admitted. "But I'll be fine. Just a warning shot," the doctor said. The days that followed were a blur of medications, blood tests, and quiet moments in hospital chairs. Evelyn and I took turns staying with him. We talked in whispers, held hands when we thought he was asleep, and shared memories like fragile stones we didn't want to drop. "I'm not ready to lose him," I told her one night as we sat in the hospital cafeteria, half-empty cups of coffee in front of us. "You're not going to," she said firmly. "Not yet." Still, the scare brought everything into sharper focus. We decided to move Allan into Evelyn's guest room once he was discharged. He protested, of course, said he didn't need babysitting, but when he realized how relieved it made both of us, he relented. "Just don't try to make me drink kale smoothies," he grumbled. We didn't. Instead, we made a routine, morning walks when he was strong enough. Afternoons spent going through old photos, stories I'd never heard. I learned about Evelyn's childhood, her piano lessons, her fear of thunderstorms, the time she broke her arm falling out of a tree. Allan filled in the blanks with sarcasm and warmth. It wasn't perfect. Some days the silence returned. Other days the past crept in like a shadow. But there was a steadiness now. A foundation built not on pretending the pain never happened, but on choosing to grow through it anyway. One night I sat beside Allan as he dozed in his recliner, a blanket over his legs, the room lit only by the flicker of the television. Evelyn was in the kitchen, humming softly. I looked at him, this man who had stepped in when he didn't have to, who had saved me without ever calling it that. "Allan," I said quietly. His eyes opened slowly. "Thank you," I whispered. He didn't ask why, he didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and patted my knee. "Took you long enough, kiddo." We both laughed, low and quiet, as the rain returned, tapping against the window like it always did in Seattle. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. I wasn't healing from a family. I was healing into one. Fall in Seattle came softly. The trees lining the streets of Capitol Hill turned into brilliant shades of amber and rust, and the sidewalks filled with scattered leaves that crunched under my boots on the walk to work. The rain still came almost daily, but it was gentler now. More rhythm than storm, more presence than interruption. Inside Evelyn's home, warmth became ritual. Allan had fully moved in by October, his room adorned with trinkets from the farm, a dusty model tractor, an old photo of him and me holding fishing poles, a folded flannel blanket he'd had for decades. Evelyn cleared space in her kitchen cabinets for his favorite teas, and in the hallway closet for his oversized coats. They bickered sometimes, like siblings. Evelyn fussed about salt intake. Allan rolled his eyes and reminded her she still couldn't cook rice without burning it. I watched it all unfold like a dream I never dared to have. A mother and a grandfather who both chose to stay, not because they were obligated, but because they wanted to. One Friday evening, Evelyn invited me to join her at a parent support group she'd been attending for a few months. She hadn't told me about it before, maybe out of guilt, or maybe because she wasn't sure how I'd react. But when she asked, I didn't hesitate. "I want to understand," I told her. The group met in the back room of a community center, a dim space with plastic chairs in a loose circle and the scent of old carpet lingering in the air. Most of the attendees were older, some with grief in their eyes, some with smiles that had clearly taken years to rebuild. They shared stories of estrangement, of children lost to addiction, anger, trauma, and some, like Evelyn, spoke about the slow, fragile process of reconnection. When it was Evelyn's turn, she took a breath and said, "My name is Evelyn, and my son is here with me tonight." All eyes turned to me. I stiffened in my seat. I gave him up when I was 17. I thought I was doing the right thing. For years, I told myself he was better off without me, and then spent the next 20 years wishing I could find a way back to him. She looked at me, her voice softening. Then one day, he opened a door I thought would stay shut forever. I didn't say anything, but I nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of her truth and mine. After the session, an older man with tired eyes and a shaky voice approached me. "I haven't seen my daughter in 12 years, he said, "but seeing you two gives me hope." Hope. It was a word I'd avoided for most of my life. Too fragile, too easily broken. But now it was beginning to feel like something solid, something I could hold in my hands without fear it would slip through my fingers. That same month, Evelyn suggested something unexpected. "Come with me to Madison," she said. I blinked. "Madison?" She nodded. "I want to see where you grew up. I want to understand it, if you're willing to go back." At first, the thought made my stomach churn. The idea of standing on the front steps of the house where I'd felt most unwanted. It was like stepping into the ghost of who I used to be. But after a long pause, I said yes. Not because I missed it, but because I needed to face it, on my terms. We flew out the following weekend, just Evelyn and me. Allan stayed behind, promising not to reorganize her spice rack while we were gone. "No promises," he'd winked. The moment we stepped off the plane in Wisconsin, I felt the weight return, not from the city, but from memory. The gray sky, the brittle wind, the streets I used to walk with my head down. It all came rushing back. We rented a car and drove slowly past familiar places. My old school, the library I used to hide in, the corner store where I once spent my last dollar on a granola bar. Evelyn watched quietly, asking questions now and then, never pushing. Finally, we pulled up to that house. It looked exactly the same. Pale blue siding, cracked driveway, the front porch light still flickering like it always did. A hollow ache formed in my chest. So many years of wanting to be seen behind those windows. So many nights of wondering what I'd done wrong. I almost told Evelyn to keep driving, but then the door opened. Martha stepped out. She looked older, smaller. The years had pressed hard against her posture, but her eyes still held that same cautious sharpness. For a moment, none of us moved. Then I opened the car door. She watched me approach without speaking. "I got your letter," I said. She nodded. "I wasn't sure if you would. I wasn't sure I'd answer." Evelyn stood a few paces behind me, hands clasped, watching carefully. "I'm not here for an apology," I continued. "You gave me a roof. That was something. But I need you to know. I was never just the boy staying with you. I was a child who needed a mother, and you chose distance every time." Martha flinched, but didn't deny it. "I've changed," she said quietly. "I've lost a lot." I took a breath. "I'm glad if you've changed, but your loss doesn't erase my pain." She looked past me to Evelyn. "She's your mother?" "Yes," I said. And then, for the first time, I saw it. Something flickering in Martha's eyes. Regret. Not enough to fix things, but maybe enough to carry her forward. "I hope she treats you better than I did," she said. "She already does," I replied. "I didn't ask to come inside, and she didn't invite me." That was the end of that chapter. Back in Seattle, I felt lighter, as if walking through that door, even metaphorically, had finally freed me from its grip. In the following weeks, Evelyn and I grew closer in quiet, natural ways. We cooked dinner together more often. We shared playlists. She told me stories of her college days, and I told her about the time I secretly cried during a high school awards ceremony because no one showed up to see me win. "I would have been there," she said softly. "I know that now," I said. One night I stayed over late, too tired to go back to my apartment. Evelyn brought out an old quilt and laid it on the couch. As she handed me a pillow, she hesitated. "I missed all your birthdays," she whispered. I looked at her and said, "We can start now." She smiled, tears in her eyes, and nodded. When November rolled around, we planned Thanksgiving together. Not the sad kind with an empty table and unanswered invitations. A real one. Evelyn cooked her infamous underseasoned stuffing. Allan made pumpkin pie from scratch. I handled the turkey with all the caution of a bomb squad. We invited neighbors, a couple of Evelyn's friends from work, even the barista who gave me too much espresso. It wasn't just a meal. It was a declaration that we had found something, chosen something, a home, a family, a new story. After dinner, Evelyn raised a glass. "To second chances," she said. Allan lifted his mug of tea. "To stubborn kids and even more stubborn mothers." Everyone laughed. And me? I looked around the room, the warmth, the laughter, the sound of forks scraping against real plates, not paper ones alone in a dorm room, and I whispered, not loud, not for anyone else, just to myself, to belonging. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, frost clung to the windows of my apartment like thin lace, and the city lights shimmered against the wet pavement every night, as if Seattle was trying to dress itself in warmth despite the cold. I spent most evenings with Evelyn and Allan, our routines now as natural as breath. We celebrated Allan's 75th birthday that month. Evelyn organized a small gathering in her living room, just the three of us, plus two of Allan's old friends from the Veterans Lodge. She strung lights across the mantel, baked a lopsided chocolate cake, and tried to force Allan to wear a paper crown. He refused, of course, said he'd rather wear a traffic cone. I got him a leather-bound notebook. He had always told stories, mostly to me, mostly at night when I couldn't sleep as a child. I figured he should start writing them down. He opened it slowly, running his calloused hand over the cover, and gave me a look I'll never forget, pride and tenderness all tangled into one. "Thanks, kiddo," he said softly. "You always knew how to listen." Work was steady, though it became harder to focus. Something inside me had shifted. The numbers and spreadsheets, the things I used to throw myself into as distractions, didn't carry the same weight anymore. What did matter? Time, connection, purpose. That realization hit hardest one rainy Thursday night as I walked past a youth shelter downtown. I passed it often but never stopped. This time I did. Through the glass door, I saw a boy, maybe 14, sitting on a worn sofa, hunched over a beat-up backpack. He reminded me of me. The way I used to sit in the corner of classrooms, shrinking into myself, praying no one would notice my hand-me-down clothes or the silence clinging to me like a second skin. I stood there for a long time, something rising in my chest. The next day, I sent an email to the shelter asking if they needed volunteers. They replied in under an hour. The first time I walked through those doors, I felt like an imposter. I didn't know how to help anyone. I didn't have a background in counseling or social work. All I had were stories, my own jagged, quiet history. But I showed up. I played board games. I listened. I shared bits of myself in small, careful portions. And over time, the kids started opening up too. There was James, who refused to make eye contact for the first 3 weeks, but eventually asked if I knew how to play chess. There was Mira, who always wore headphones and never spoke, until one night she handed me one earbud and said, "This song makes me feel less angry." I listened. I always listened. One night, a boy named Dax, 15, wiry, sarcastic, asked me point blank, "Why do you come here? You some kind of savior?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I come here because when I was your age, I needed someone to show up. And someone did." He scoffed. "Did it change anything?" I thought about Allan, about Evelyn, about where I'd be if Allan hadn't noticed me in the background of his own son's life. "Yeah," I said. "It changed everything." Evelyn supported my volunteering without question. In fact, it brought us closer. "I've been trying to find a way to make it right," she said one night over dinner. "But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe it's not about fixing the past. Maybe it's about planting something new." She was right. We can't rewrite the chapters that were already printed, but we can draft new ones that begin not with apology, but with action. By mid-December, snow arrived, rare for Seattle, but beautiful. Evelyn's living room became the center of our world. Allan stayed bundled in thick sweaters, sipping tea and pretending not to eavesdrop on our conversations. Evelyn started knitting, badly, and refused to stop. I brought over records and books and sometimes just sat by the window with her in silence. And one night, while Allan was asleep and the city glowed in silver outside, Evelyn turned to me and said, "I never thought I'd get a second chance to be your mother." I looked at her, tired, kind, vulnerable, in a way that made her more real than ever. "You didn't get a second chance," I replied. "You created one." She smiled then, and I saw it. Not guilt, not sorrow, but peace. Peace we'd earned, together. On Christmas morning, we cooked breakfast as snowflakes drifted down like a silent benediction. No gifts, no fanfare, just 3 people sharing eggs and stories. Later, Evelyn pulled out a small box and handed it to me. Inside was a photograph, restored and framed. It was the picture of her holding me the day I was born. "I had it cleaned up," she said. "Thought you should have a version that didn't fade." I traced the edges of the frame, my throat tight. "I think," I said, "this is the first time I believe that I belong to someone." "You've always belonged," she said softly, "even when I didn't know how to show it." Allan raised his mug. "To beginnings," he said, and we clinked our glasses to that. Not to endings, not to erasing what came before, but to beginnings. The kind that are born not out of perfection, but persistence. The kind that teach you love isn't just about who's there in the good times. It's about who stays when the silence gets loud. January arrived like a hush over the city. Seattle's pace slowed, streets cleared. People stayed inside more, bundled in sweaters and buried in books or thoughts. The fog lingered longer each morning, thick and stubborn, as if even the weather wanted to stay tucked in. But inside Evelyn's home and mine, something was shifting. Quietly, gently, but undeniably, we were starting to feel like a real family, not just in title, in rhythm, in unspoken comfort. Allan's health had improved. He was back to his evening walks, often wandering down to the waterfront just to make sure the bay hasn't moved, as he put it. He was writing more too, filling pages in the notebook I'd given him, stories from his youth, from the farm, from those early days with me. Sometimes I'd catch him sitting on the porch, lost in memory, pen in hand. "You're writing about me again, aren't you?" I asked one day, stepping outside with 2 mugs of tea. He grinned without looking up. "Don't flatter yourself. I'm just writing about a stubborn little boy who used to cry when tomatoes weren't perfectly round." I handed him the tea. "So it is about me. Shut up and drink." At work, things were steady, but something tugged at me. I'd been volunteering at the youth shelter every Saturday now, and the more time I spent there, the more I started to question the path I was on. One evening, after helping Dax prep for a math test, I stayed behind with one of the shelter coordinators, Rosa. She was sharp, kind, and had a laugh that cracked like lightning. "You're good with them," she said, scribbling notes on a clipboard. "Thanks," I said, unsure of what else to offer. "You ever think about doing this full-time?" I blinked. "You mean social work?" She nodded. "Or something close to it. You've got the patience and the heart." That word hit me harder than I expected. Heart. For years I'd buried mine beneath numbers and routine, but now, maybe I wanted to live differently. That night, I sat with Evelyn and Allan and told them everything. My doubts, the pull toward something new, the fear that I was leaving stability behind. Evelyn listened quietly, then said, "You've spent your whole life making everyone else feel seen. Maybe now it's time you followed what you see for yourself." Allan nodded. "You're not starting over. You're starting forward." 2 weeks later, I applied to a graduate program in community counseling. It wasn't a complete leap, just a turn, a shift in course. But for the first time, the future felt like mine to shape. In February, Evelyn asked me a question I didn't expect. "Would you ever consider changing your last name?" I looked up from the guitar I was tuning, surprised. "To what?" "To Thatcher, or maybe something else. Something that reflects the family you've built, the one you chose." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. It wasn't about legal paperwork. It wasn't about matching signatures on a document. It was about identity, about belonging. I sat with the question for days, not because I didn't want to, but because I finally understood the gravity of what it meant. My last name had always felt borrowed. Now, maybe, I was ready to choose one of my own. I talked it over with Allan. "Names don't define you," he said, "but choosing your own, that's power. That's you saying who you are." "What would you do?" I asked. "I'd take the name of the people who stood beside me when I needed them most." I smiled. It was simple, really. 2 weeks later, I filed the paperwork to change my last name. Thatcher Rhodes. Thatcher for Evelyn, the mother who found her way back to me. Rhodes for Allan, the man who kept me alive when the world didn't care if I was breathing. When Evelyn saw the form, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet exhale, a hand to her mouth, a nod that said everything. That spring, something unexpected happened. Martha called. I let it ring twice, then I picked up. "Hello? Caleb," she said, voice cautious. I heard about the name change. I waited. I just wanted to say, "I understand." A pause. "And I'm glad you found something that feels like yours." I didn't know what to say to that, but I said something anyway. "Thank you for saying that." And then, before she could add anything more, I said goodbye. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. Just done. Not bitter, not wounded, just free. On the day the name change became official, Evelyn threw a small celebration. Of course she did. She baked a cake that leaned slightly to one side and spelled my new name in too much icing. Allan played an old folk song on his guitar and muttered that the chords were as old as my joints. We danced in the living room, badly. And when the lights dimmed, Evelyn hugged me, pulling me tight into the kind of embrace I used to dream about as a boy. "You're my son," she whispered. "Not just because of blood, because of choice, and I'll never stop choosing you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because for the first time in my life, everything felt exactly right, exactly whole, exactly mine. Spring melted into summer slowly, like the city itself didn't want to rush what was finally beginning to bloom. By June, Seattle's skies turned softer, the clouds lighter. Evelyn started opening the windows more. Allan took to watering his tomato plants with what he called surgical precision. And I felt like I was becoming someone I finally recognized. Classes for my counseling program started in July. I hadn't been a student in years, and the first time I sat in a circle with others, people from different backgrounds, carrying their own stories and bruises, I felt out of place. Until I didn't. We shared why we were there. Some said it was about making a difference. Others spoke about healing wounds they'd carried since childhood. When it was my turn, I simply said, "I want to be the person I once needed." No one questioned it. One of my professors, a sharp-eyed woman named Lydia with a soft, commanding voice, pulled me aside after class one day. "You speak like someone who's learned things the hard way," she said. I nodded. "That's the only way I ever learned." She smiled. "Then maybe you're exactly where you need to be." Back at home, Allan began to slow down. Not in a dramatic way, just gradually. His walks shortened, his stories grew longer, as though he was trying to pass them all to us while he still had the strength. Evelyn noticed it before I did. "He's tired," she said one night as we cleaned up dinner. Not just physically. We didn't say more. We didn't need to. One morning I found him sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the early mist rolling off the sound. He looked peaceful. "Thinking?" I asked, handing him a cup of coffee. "Always," he said. "But lately it's about you." I raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" "You've come full circle," he said, not looking at me. "You started as the boy no one saw. Now you help others be seen." I sat beside him, the wood beneath us still cool from the night. "I wouldn't be here without you," I said. "No," he replied. "You wouldn't, and I'm damn proud of that." We sat in silence, the kind only shared by people who've walked through storms together. "I want you to keep telling our story," he said after a while. "Our story?" He nodded. "People need to know that not all families start at birth. Some are built, stubbornly, slowly, beautifully." I promised him I would, and I meant it. A few weeks later, Allan was admitted to the hospital for pneumonia. At first, the doctors were optimistic, but we could see it in his eyes. He was ready, not because he didn't love us, but because he finally believed we'd be okay without him. He stayed with us for 2 more days. On the last morning, the sun broke through the hospital room window in golden streaks. Evelyn sat on one side of the bed, her hand wrapped around his. I sat on the other, holding his notebook, now mostly full. Allan opened his eyes one final time, looked at both of us, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You two, you did it." "Did what?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "You became a family." And then, with one last breath, he was gone. We buried him on a hill overlooking the water. Evelyn and I stood side by side in the soft breeze, surrounded by a few of his old friends, some neighbors, and the quiet sound of gulls above. No speeches, just silence, and a song he once played for us on the porch. Played now from a speaker, the chords slightly off, just like he always preferred it. Later that evening, Evelyn and I sat in her living room, the light fading around us. "He gave us everything," she said. I nodded. "Even when we didn't know how to ask." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "We have to keep going, Caleb, for him." "We will," I whispered, and in the flicker of candlelight we both knew. Allan may have left this world, but he'd given us something permanent. Not just memories, not just wisdom, but roots. Roots in a family we never expected. A family we built. A family we chose. Grief, I learned, isn't a storm that passes. It's a tide. It comes in slow at first, barely brushing your feet. Then one day, without warning, it swells, rising over your chest, stealing your breath before slipping away again, leaving the sand changed. After Allan's funeral, life didn't go back to normal. It became something new. The days felt quieter, but not hollow. Evelyn and I moved through them gently, watering his tomato plants, rereading pages of his notebook aloud, laughing at his stubborn notes in the margins. Terrible pie recipe. Use less nutmeg. Caleb cried the first time he held a wrench. Don't let him deny it. Those scribbles, equal parts tenderness and mischief, kept him with us. Every Sunday, we kept our tradition. Breakfast at Evelyn's, coffee with too much cream, a walk by the water. We didn't talk about loss every time. Sometimes we just talked about life, about my classes, about her clients, about how the rain in Seattle could feel like both a weight and a cleansing. One Sunday, about a month after Allan passed, we sat on a bench near Pike Place Market. The water shimmered below us, boats moving slow like thoughts not yet formed. Evelyn turned to me, a hesitant smile on her face. "I've been thinking about writing a book," she said. I looked at her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "About us, about everything. Not a memoir, not a pity piece. Just a story of what love looks like when it doesn't arrive the way you expect it to." I smiled. "I think you should. Will you help me?" she asked. "There are parts I can't tell without your voice." I didn't even hesitate. Always. And just like that, another beginning took root. That summer, I finished my first semester in the counseling program. I passed every class. More importantly, I connected with professors, with classmates, with the future I was shaping, one decision at a time. I started working part-time at the youth shelter, officially this time, not just as a volunteer, as a mentor. Dax was still there, still sarcastic, but he started asking more real questions now. "Do you ever think about your birth parents?" he asked one evening, while we stacked chairs after a group session. "All the time," I said, "but I think more about the people who showed up." He nodded, didn't say much. But the next week, he showed up early, said he wanted to talk. That was enough. On the first anniversary of Allan's death, Evelyn and I drove north to a lake he used to mention, a place from his youth where he and his father once fished in the early mornings. We brought sandwiches, his guitar, and the notebook he left behind. We sat by the shore reading his stories aloud. One passage, written in his last weeks, stood out. "Family isn't built from blood or names. It's built in quiet mornings, in forgiveness offered without being asked, in the hands that lift you when you're too tired to stand on your own. Caleb and Evelyn, you made something real. Hold on to it. Don't let the world convince you that you need permission to be a family. You already are." Evelyn cried. So did I. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming fullness of being known. Years passed. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily. I graduated from the program. Took a full-time position at the shelter. Eventually opened a community center with Evelyn's help, a space for young people who felt like I once did, voiceless, rootless, invisible. We named it The Porch, after Allan, after the place I was first seen. Evelyn helped design it. She insisted on big windows, lots of music, and books everywhere. "No one should ever feel like they have to earn a place to sit," she said, and they didn't. Sometimes I think about the boy I was, the one sitting alone at Thanksgiving, waiting for a family that never showed up. And I want to reach back through time, take his hand and whisper, "Just wait. Your people are coming. Not the ones you were born to, the ones who choose you." Now when I sit at our table, Evelyn to my left, neighbors and friends and kids from the shelter all around, I see it clearly. Family isn't always who you start with. It's who you find along the way. It's the people who walk into your quiet, your ache, your empty spaces, and stay. The end.